Hey Reddit, I'm here because I feel like I'm losing my grip on what actually happened in my own marriage, and I need someone outside my head to sanity check this. My wife and I were together for 12 years, married for 9. We weren't dramatic. No screaming fights. No breakups and reunions. We were the kind of couple people described as stable, the kind that gave advice to others. That's why what started happening caught me completely off guard. It began with small comments. Casual, almost harmless. She'd say things like, "You were never really affectionate," or "You always hated going out with my friends." At first, I laughed them off. Everyone remembers things differently, right? But then the comments became statements. Statements became facts. And facts became accusations. She'd tell stories about our past, to me, to friends, to family, that didn't line up with my memory at all. Moments I remembered as happy suddenly became examples of my emotional distance. Arguments we resolved years ago were reframed as proof that I'd always been controlling. When I gently pushed back, she'd sign say, "You don't remember things very clearly." That sentence stayed with me, because I remember planning trips, showing up, compromising, supporting her through job changes, family drama, anxiety. I remembered being present. But slowly, her version of the past started replacing mine. Not because it was true, but because she said it so confidently, so consistently, that I began questioning myself. I told myself this was just how relationships evolve, that we were reevaluating things, that it was healthy. I didn't realize yet that she wasn't reflecting on the past. She was rewriting it. At first, I tried to treat it like a normal disagreement in perspective. When she said, "You never supported my career," I reminded her of the late nights I stayed up helping her prep for interviews. When she claimed, "You hated my friends," I mentioned the birthdays, the dinners, the weekends I showed up even when I was exhausted. She didn't argue the details. She questioned my memory. "I think you remember it that way because it makes you feel better," she said once calmly. Not cruelly, like a therapist explaining a concept. Another time she told me, "You've always had this habit of rewriting things in your head." That was new and unsettling. I started second-guessing myself. I'd replay moments over and over, trying to see them through her lens. I wondered if I really had been distant without realizing it. If I'd been a worse partner than I thought. What made it worse was how she'd bring these revised memories up in front of other people. At a dinner with friends, she laughed and said, "Remember how you never wanted to go out back then?" Everyone nodded like it was a harmless joke. I smiled along, even though that wasn't how I remembered it at all. Correcting her in public felt petty, defensive, exactly the thing she'd later use as proof. So I stayed quiet, and slowly, something shifted. Our arguments stopped being about the present. They were about a past I no longer felt qualified to talk about. Because somehow, without me noticing when it happened, my own experiences had become negotiable, and that scared me more than any fight ever had. The moment it stopped feeling accidental was the day she contradicted herself. We were talking about an old vacation, one I remembered clearly because it was the first time we'd traveled after getting married. I mentioned how happy she'd been, how relaxed. She smiled and said, "That trip was actually when I first realized how lonely I felt with you." That didn't match anything I remembered. A few days later, we were with her sister, and the same trip came up. This time, my wife laughed and said, "That was one of the happiest times of our marriage." I froze, not because she changed her mind, but because she didn't even seem to notice she'd rewritten it again. Later that night, I brought it up carefully. I told her the two versions didn't line up. I wasn't accusing her. I was genuinely confused. She looked at me like I'd disappointed her. "You always do this," she said. "You latch onto tiny inconsistencies instead of looking at the bigger picture." I asked her what the bigger picture was. "That you weren't emotionally available," she replied. "And you never have been." Never. That word echoed in my head. Never erased everything I remember doing right. Every effort. Every compromise. Every time I showed up. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about memory differences. It was about control. If the past could be reshaped at will, then the present was already decided. And in her version of reality, I was always the problem, even retroactively. I didn't say anything else that night, but something fundamental shifted. Because once you notice a pattern being used against you, you stop trying to fix it. You start protecting yourself. After that conversation, I started paying attention in a different way. Every disagreement somehow traced back to my pattern. If I was upset in the present, it was because I'd always been insecure. If I asked for clarity, it was because I'd never trusted her. If I disagreed, it was proof that I couldn't accept responsibility. The past wasn't just being rewritten, it was being used. She'd bring up old moments at exactly the right time. Not to resolve them, but to shut me down. If I said, "That's not how I remember it," she'd sigh and say, "This is what I mean." You can't handle uncomfortable truths. Uncomfortable truths. I started noticing how confidently she spoke when other people were around. She'd tell stories about our relationship that positioned her as patient, long-suffering, endlessly understanding, and me as emotionally distant, difficult, passive. No one challenged her. Why would they? She sounded calm, reasonable, certain. Meanwhile, I was hesitating before speaking at all, afraid that any disagreement would just be folded into the story she was already telling about me. The worst part wasn't that people believed her. It was that I started wondering if I should. I caught myself thinking, what if I really was that guy? What if I just didn't see it? That's when I realized how dangerous this had become. Because when someone controls the past, they don't have to argue the present. And once I saw that clearly, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was just miscommunication. Something else was happening. Something deliberate. The thing that finally confirmed it wasn't dramatic. No confession. No caught-in-the-act moment. It was a single sentence she didn't realize she'd said out loud. We were arguing, calmly, at least on the surface, about something current. I don't even remember what started it. I just remember saying, "I feel like you're not hearing me." She didn't hesitate. "That's because you've always needed to be the victim," she said. Always. The word landed like a punch. I asked her since when. She waved it off. Since the beginning. You just don't remember it that way. There was again. Not disagreement. Not a different perspective. A dismissal of my reality. Later that night, I replayed that sentence over and over. Always needed to be the victim. It was too polished. Too complete. Like a conclusion she'd reached long before that conversation. And suddenly, other things clicked into place. The way she'd tell friends, "He means well, but he struggles with accountability." The way she'd preface stories with, "You know how he is." The way disagreements ended not with resolution, but with me apologizing for things I wasn't sure I'd done. This wasn't spontaneous. It was a framework. She wasn't remembering the past differently. She was defining it. And once I understood that, I realized the danger wasn't just that she was rewriting history. It was that she was positioning herself as the authority on who I was. And if I stayed silent long enough, that version of me would be the only one left. After that night, I noticed something unsettling about my own behavior. I was constantly explaining myself. Every disagreement turned into a defense. Every memory needed proof. Every feeling had to be justified before it was allowed to exist. I'd start sentences with, "I'm not trying to blame you, but," or "Maybe I'm remembering this wrong, but." I was preemptively apologizing for having a perspective. That's when it hit me. Defending myself wasn't helping. It was feeding the dynamic. The more I tried to clarify, the more she positioned herself as the calm arbiter of truth and me as the unreliable narrator. So I stopped. The next time she said, "You've always been emotionally distant," I didn't argue. I didn't list examples. I just said, "I don't agree with that." She blinked, caught off guard. "That's not how everyone else sees it." "Okay," I said. That response irritated her more than any rebuttal ever had. She pushed harder, brought up old moments, reframed conversations, waited for me to engage. I didn't. I stayed neutral, calm, brief, and that's when her tone changed. She stopped sounding certain and started sounding frustrated, like a teacher whose student wasn't following the lesson plan. I realized something important then. My confusion had been useful to her. As long as I was busy questioning myself, she didn't have to question her version of events. The moment I stopped defending myself, the ground shifted. I wasn't proving anything. I was reclaiming my reality, and she could feel it slipping. Once I stopped defending myself, she started escalating. Not loudly, not obviously, in subtle ways meant to pull me back into the role I'd been playing. She'd sigh dramatically and say things like, "I guess I'm the only one who remembers how things really were." Or she'd shake her head and add, "This is why it's so hard to talk to you." Normally, that would have sent me scrambling to explain. This time I didn't. I just nod or say, "That's your perspective." That response drove her crazy. She began bringing other people into it more openly. She'd mention how her sister agreed with her, how a friend once said I seemed closed off, how a therapist she talked to believed unresolved issues from my childhood explained my behavior. All secondhand, all impossible to verify. Why I didn't react? She got sharper. "You know," she said one night, "most people would have left a long time ago." I looked at her and said, "Then why didn't you?" She paused. "Not long, but long enough. I was trying to help you," she replied. That answer chilled me, because it framed everything she'd been doing, rewriting memories, questioning my sanity, positioning herself as the reasonable one, as an act of kindness, as if control was care. And that's when I realized something important. She didn't need me to agree with her version of the past. She needed me to doubt mine. The moment that stopped happening, she wasn't just frustrated. She was threatened. Once she realized I wasn't doubting myself anymore, her version of reality started slipping. She began contradicting herself more often. Small things at first. Dates. Who said what? When certain conversations supposedly happened. I didn't point them out. I just noticed them. One evening, she claimed she'd been clear for years about feeling unhappy. The next day, she told a friend on the phone that everything had only started going downhill recently. Same issue, two different timelines depending on the audience. Before, I would have tried to reconcile those contradictions, tried to understand, tried to help her clarify. This time I stayed quiet, and silence did something interesting. It removed the pressure for her to be consistent. She assumed I wasn't paying attention anymore. That's when the bigger cracks showed. She told me, during an argument, that she'd never felt safe being honest with me. But later that same week, she accused me of ignoring all the time she tried to communicate. Both couldn't be true. When I calmly said, "Those things don't line up," she snapped. "Yeah, they're doing it again." Picking apart words instead of listening. But I was listening, more clearly than ever. What finally hit me was this. Her story only worked as long as I was actively confused. The moment I wasn't, it required constant maintenance, constant correction, constant pressure, constant emotional leverage. And maintaining a false reality is exhausting. I could see it wearing on her. She was losing the calm certainty she once had. Her confidence wasn't rooted in truth. It was rooted in my hesitation. And now that hesitation was gone, that's when I realized I wasn't just witnessing manipulation anymore. I was watching it fail. Something shifted after that. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single argument or breakthrough conversation. It was quieter than that. I just stopped feeling the need to convince her of anything. I realized that for years I'd been arguing for permission. Permission to remember things the way I remembered them. Permission to feel hurt. Permission to disagree without it becoming a character flaw. And the truth was, no amount of explaining was ever going to earn that permission. So I stopped asking for it. The next time she said, "You're remembering it wrong," I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. I just said, "I know what I experienced." She laughed softly. "You really think you're right about everything now?" "No," I said. "I just trust myself more than I used to." That unsettled her. She tried to pull me back in with guilt, reminding me of everything she'd put up with. When that didn't work, she tried fear, hinting at how other people might see me if I didn't take responsibility. When that failed too, she went quiet. And in that quiet, I finally heard my own thoughts clearly. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't scrambling to fix the story. I knew who I was. I knew what I'd lived. And I knew that staying meant slowly erasing myself to make room for her version of reality. That's when I understood something simple and terrifying at the same time. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about whether I was willing to lose myself to keep the peace. Once I trusted myself again, the relationship changed shape. Not outwardly, the routines were still there. We still ate dinner together, still talked about practical things. But internally, I'd stepped out of the role I'd been playing for years. The one who tried to smooth things over, explain himself, make sense of contradictions. I stopped correcting her stories. When she told a friend on the phone that I'd always struggled with communication, I didn't jump in to clarify. When she said I was bad with emotions, I didn't argue. I let the words pass through the room without chasing them. That silence bothered her more than any fight ever had. Later that night she asked, "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" I answered honestly, "Because it wouldn't have changed anything." She frowned. "So you're just letting people believe things that aren't true?" I looked at her and said, "I'm letting the truth take care of itself." That was the moment I stopped trying to save her narrative. Because I realized something crucial. As long as I was reacting to the story she told about me, I was still inside it. Stepping out didn't require proving her wrong. It required refusing to participate. And once I did that, the relationship stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like what it really was, a power struggle over reality. When I no longer wanted to win, when I wanted to leave. Once I stopped engaging, the shift in power became impossible to ignore. She grew restless, irritable. The calm confidence she used to carry cracked around the edges. She started revisiting old arguments, bringing them up out of nowhere, like she was trying to restart conversations that no longer existed. "You never answer me about that trip," she said one night. "Which trip?" I asked. "The one where you made me feel alone," she replied. I nodded. "Okay, that was it." She stared at me, waiting for more, waiting for the defense, the explanation, the apology. When none came, her voice sharpened. "Don't you care how I felt?" "I care," I said. "I just don't agree with how you're framing it." That was the moment I saw it clearly. She didn't need validation of her feelings. She needed confirmation of her authority over the past. And without that, she didn't know how to proceed. She tried a different angle. Told me I was becoming cold, that I was detaching, that this was proof I'd always been emotionally unavailable. I didn't argue, because for the first time, those labels didn't stick. They floated past me, weightless. I realized then that her control had never come from being right. It came from my need to explain myself. And now that need was gone, the realization didn't come with fireworks. There was no dramatic fight where I stormed out or declared anything final. It came one morning while I was sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing ever changes, can I live like this? The answer came immediately, and it wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was no. I understood then that the relationship wasn't broken because of one argument or one misunderstanding. It was broken because I wasn't allowed to exist in it as a full person. My memories were negotiable. My feelings were suspect. My reality required approval. That's not a partnership. That evening, she started another familiar conversation, revisiting the past, reframing something I'd supposedly done wrong years ago. Halfway through her sentence, I interrupted her gently. "I'm not doing this anymore," I said. She blinked. "Doing what?" "Arguing about who I am," I replied. She laughed once, short and sharp. "So what? You just giving up?" I shook my head. "I'm choosing myself." The room went quiet. Not tense, empty. Because in that moment, I wasn't threatening to leave. I had already left emotionally, and she could feel it. After that conversation, the house felt different. Not hostile, not tense, just hollow. She didn't argue, didn't chase the discussion. She moved through the rooms quietly, like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. I think she expected me to come back, to re-engage, to explain myself, to soften my words. I didn't. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. I wasn't bracing for the next reframing of the past or the next subtle correction of who I was supposed to be. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I felt calm, not relieved yet, not happy, just calm, the kind that comes when your mind finally stops fighting itself. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I noticed how often I'd been shrinking myself just to keep conversations from turning into trials. She noticed a change too. "You're really serious about this," she said one evening, almost to herself. "Yes," I replied. That was all. I realized then that my silence wasn't punishment. It was clarity. And clarity doesn't argue. It simply exists. For the first time, the story of my life wasn't being negotiated in real time. It was mine again. Just when things felt settled, she tried one more time. Not with anger. Not with blame. With softness. She suggested we talk like adults, just to clear the air. Said she wanted closure. That she'd been reflecting. That maybe she'd been too hard on me. The words were careful, measured, the kind designed to reopen a door without admitting it had ever been closed. We sat across from each other at the table. Same place where so many conversations had quietly gone off the rails. She started with, "I think we both misunderstood each other for a long time." There it was. Both. She talked about growth, about perspective, about how memory is complicated, how no one is ever fully right or wrong. She wasn't apologizing. She was smoothing the edges, editing the ending. I listened, calmly. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for agreement, for shared responsibility, for the past to become blurry again. I said, "I don't need to agree on the past to know how I felt living in it." Her expression tightened, just slightly. She tried again. "So you don't think you played a part in this?" "I think I did," I replied. I stayed too long. That ended the conversation, because there was nothing left to negotiate. No version of events left to reconcile. I wasn't asking her to see things my way anymore. I'd already stopped asking. It's strange how quiet life becomes once you stop defending yourself. The noise fades, the second-guessing, the mental rewrites, the urge to explain who you are before anyone misunderstands you. What's left isn't emptiness. It's space. I learned that being calm doesn't always mean being safe. That stability can be an illusion when only one person is allowed to define reality. And that self-trust, once lost, has to be reclaimed deliberately. If you're reading this, and you feel like you're constantly explaining your intentions, your memories, your character, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from that confusion. You don't need to win an argument about the past to know when something is wrong in the present. The moment I stopped negotiating my reality was the moment I got my life back.